G'day and welcome to People Purpose Place with our lunchtime catch-up. G'day. This week we've got Riley Flanigan as our guest speaker. G'day, Riley.
Hey everyone, how are we?
And of course we've got our Christine Doan and Darren Finlay as our regular ensemble. But it's fantastic to catch up with different fields of expertise. So Riley comes to us with a background in urban design and a city strategist. And I've read a few of your articles just recently, and particularly, Riley, that sort of piqued my interest. So I thought we best get you along to People Purpose Place to have a chat.
No, happy to
So
be
thank you.
here. Always
Thank
happy
you
to
for
talk
making
about
time
housing.
and foregoing your... Yeah, brilliant. And as part of our general conversation, we sort of tune ourselves into a meeting with a bit of a checking question, which gives us just a chance to get us all on the same page, Riley, if you can humour us. Coming from a planning background, what do you think is the importance of planning, and what perhaps are some of the weaknesses?
Well, I have a spicy opinion on this because I have a planning background, and I have worked most of my career in urban design, though I've never actually worked as a planner, but I do sort of work with them all the time and am exposed to the issues. And what I always notice is that with this issue, people always sort of apply their own expertise to it, and therefore think it's the most important lens through which to view it. And designers, I think, are the worst at this, where they just think, well, we just haven't really nailed that perfect co-living typology that could just completely unlock this whole issue, and there's nothing else holding it back other than just lack of innovation in design or lack of innovation in planning. And the more I sort of look into and write about this issue, the more I sort of realize that it is just a political issue, because designers can only design what we're being asked to design. Planners can only write planning codes for what is politically salient from above, and politicians can only communicate and advocate for policies that their constituents ultimately want. So at the end of the day, it is a political issue, and that's why all of these sort of sub-disciplines haven't been able to make a dent in it, despite being very unhappy about it for a very long.
Totally. Every discipline we speak to about the issue says that the change is not happening, and we can see some issues that could be addressed from an engineering, a town planning, a finance point of view. But in actual fact, none of those decisions are coming forward or are able to be presented by politicians. So we have a 30-year problem in the making, and no change happening along the way. Darren, what did you have any comments for the check-in?
Yeah. I mean, I wrote the check-in question because it normally gives me just a little bit more time to research than everyone else. I wrote the question sort of a little bit tongue-in-cheek because I think that the planning is important. Like, I think that the concept of providing a framework that we all can work within is a function that is actually quite valuable. And I think there has been examples of, what happens when you let everything go to helter-skelter. My biggest criticism of the process is it's so far behind the coalface. So it's such a glitchy mechanism to be able to, a bit like sometimes our internet on this podcast, but it's really slow to adapt to what is actually happening out there in the coalface. So, by the time it feeds through all of the departments and they have a discussion and say, oh, someone's asking, as you mentioned, about co-housing, or someone's starting to talk about more granny flats or relatives apartments, or whatever we want to classify them. Normally the problem is already at catastrophic levels. So I do think that it has a lot of strength to do with giving us a playing field to play within, so developers don't just go helter-skelter and do it all about dollars and cents and none of it about the people living in it. But I think its biggest weakness is it's it's so slow to adapt to what we're actually needing. And we can see that now. We're at a catastrophic situation, and we're still, you know, reaching for the handbrake, trying to figure out what the hell's going on.
Good points. Shall I go next?
Please. Yeah.
Look, I'm going to make a short comment, which is that, like in so many individual endeavors and like in so many collective endeavors, when we see this in our own lives, sometimes we go into something with the best of intentions and really smart thinking, and they have our smartest thoughts and our best intentions have unintended consequences. And I think that if you, I mean, you can hear where I came from. It was Michigan, actually, not California. But if you think about California, the state rules allowed people to decide how they wanted their neighborhoods. Well, that's such a wonderful intention. But it ended up that you can't even find a place to rent in San Francisco because everybody said, not in my backyard. Bananas, NIMBY, you know, they just wouldn't put up with anything. And the good intention of allowing people to have the neighborhood they wanted turned out to be the rich people got what they wanted and the poor people got, well, I don't even because it's too rude on the internet. It's me. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and this is always a spicy point to make. But you know, like you said, community consultation, who could possibly be mad at an idea like that? But it completely, I guess, disregards the huge weight of incentives of the economy and land ownership and the incentives of people who already own land versus those who don't and are trying to, and how landowners can use the state apparatus to enrich themselves at the expense of people who can't yet do it. So it's, and then once they get their land, they do it. You know what I mean? And you're kind of crazy not to, because it is a direct one-for-one relationship between money and action. And so, you know, I was thinking about this just earlier today, where, you know, a lot of kind of like, let's say South Korea, for example, you know, where everybody lives in an apartment ostensibly, you know, they weren't always like that. At some point in their history, they were all living in single-story buildings, and they made that transition much before we did, because we've always had this frontier of being a large country with a small population, where there's always been this readily available land in convenient locations where people spewed out of Europe for this exact opportunity to you know, and this is essentially why we have a middle class, is because normal people have been able to ride property to the middle class without ostensibly having to do anything. And that framework of incentives has kind of ripened and matured to the point where now there's real spatial things happening, where there's X amount of distance from job centers and X amount of houses with Y amount of people trying to buy that, you know what I mean? And all of these things are kind of hitting a tipping point where that frontier is now gone. And we are kind of completely hamstrung and unequipped to meet this challenge with the way we've set up our system. Whereas a lot of other countries made this transition before any of that happened.
You know, Riley, I'd like to make a comment there, because I think I'm a good example. I'm sorry, I don't know how to turn that off. I'm so sorry. The fact is that I've taken advantage of negative gearing and all of the things that, all the tax incentives that property allows you to do. And yet I'm one of the few people who has voted against my economic interests and said, I think we should get rid of a lot of that shit because it's not helping the work that all of us need to collectively do. But how many people are able to vote against their immediate economic interests?
Well, you needed a lifetime of poisoning. You needed a lifetime of mental poisoning to do this.
That's it. And how many people are willing to say, like I am, I'm a hypocrite? I'm a hypocrite. How many people are willing to say that and even analyze? I'm voting against my own economic interest, but I'm still taking advantage of the tax code.
But
Where's
this
that
is why
helping?
I don't like to get into like the baby boomer bashing, because
Oh, I'm fine
you know
with
what I
that.
mean?
I'm a proper boomer. You can bash all you like.
I appreciate that, the opportunity, but I don't like to do it because I recognize that, you know, you can't expect people to be educated on something as nebulous and as intricate and as, you know, complex as this, and then make decisions, like you said, against their own financial interests at the mass scale. Like any strategy that expects that is doomed to fail. And the baby boomers, just like everyone before them, were following the incentives that were put in front of them. And
that's right. The environment they're in, the game they had to play.
yeah, and it's the problem with incentives is they work, you know, and if we you know, if we want a different system, we need different incentives. And this is kind of what I get into in my article, is that we unfortunately, as far as I can see, and I'm a bit of a pessimist at times, so then maybe I'm wrong. Hopefully I'm wrong, but it seems to me like we do not have the mechanism to reconcile this at the political level. And I think, unfortunately, you know, this is kind of a bug and a feature of democracy, is that things need to be visibly worse in order for things to change. So you'll need there to be someone shooting up on your doorstep in order for you to like ask what the acronym YIMBY stands for.
Yeah, and I think that's actually one of the big realizations we've had, and then a couple of points that we picked out there is the system at the moment is the profits first and people last, and that's, you know, as a not-for-profit, that's originally why we came up with people, purpose, place, not the other way around, because that's the way the current system is, and that's one of the massive challenges. But we've also had the realization that the idea of trying to get a political system which has its own ulterior motives to try and align with this, dealing with this real crisis, is, I agree with you, almost impossible, because I don't think they have the ability to, one, you know, the election period doesn't allow them to do anything other than what's in their best interests. And secondly, this crisis has actually been a lot deeper. Like, we've been working in this space for between sustainability and housing affordability for a very long period of time. And I even dig up some of my data from 2018 and go, you would not believe the depth of this crisis in 2018. Like, and when you look at the raw data, you go, holy crap, like, why aren't we acting? And then 5 years later, we look at the data in 2023 and go, oh my God, you know, I was paying this for fuel, now I'm paying that for fuel. You know, I bought a lettuce at 29 cents, now it's $1.30. And the unthinkable amount of capital growth that has occurred in capital cities, even in that period of time, through, you know, lots of other factors. So I agree with you. I actually think that the change needs to occur by people doing alternative things, because waiting for a political system to adjust or change, I believe, is impossible. They just don't have the mechanism to get there. So I empathize with you currently. And that might even be a good segue into maybe asking a little bit more about your background, and also understanding, you know, why this has become personally a thorn in your side. So would you be able to just fill in a bit of the detail on your personal experience on that?
I don't think there's nothing too particularly interesting about it, because I think, you know, I'm 34, and you know, I was like around was it 2019, 2020, I was looking for a house, and you know, just being hit with the cold reality of like what I could afford and where I could afford, and you know what that was going to mean for commuting, because I'm, you know, have to work in the city. I'm always going to have to work in the city based on my career, what I've chosen. And so just like the the pigeonhole that kind of puts you into, and it was just kind of working me up. And then you experience the vampire-ridden process of having to buy a house, and you see all the people that come along and take their pound of flesh, and you're googling why lenders mortgage insurance exists, and you're thinking, wait a minute, so I'm paying the bank so that they have no risk lending me money. Like, why am I paying this? Like, just like, I just sort of, I thought, because of my career, I know a bit more about this than the average person, and I'd also just been following a lot. Like, I find the people who actually make the most sense on this issue are like journalists and economists, not really planners, because I think planners just have that very sort of like one-dimensional planning view on things, whereas like I think journalists sort of have that, okay, I've got to figure out everything about it kind of issue. So there's a few people in America who I'd been following who were just making a lot of sense on the issue, and then I just sort of I dipped my toe into it by just explaining it, I guess, and then I ended up writing an article that did pretty well, and then I thought, oh, I don't want to be a person who just whinges about the problem. I want to actually try to like figure it out. So I'm like, oh, I'm just going to get to the bottom of this. I'm going to write an article about solving the housing crisis, and then I realized, oh, I can't do this. Like, this is actually covers too many disciplines. It covers economics. It covers everything basically, because it's such a nebulous issue that touches every little aspect of society. It's it's not just about design. It's not just about planning. It's about how we grow our wealth. It's about how much space they take up in cities. It's about cultural ingrained expectations, and so I ended up writing 3 articles on housing policy responses for it, then with 2 of them being about increasing supply, and then 1 of them about decreasing demand, which I was really out of my depth on, to be honest. I shouldn't, because it was, again, it's impossible to be an expert on this issue, which is why I think it's so nebulous. And then the final article that I just wrote, I wrote one that basically takes all of those policy proposals and says, okay, which ones of those are actually politically salient? Which ones of those could actually get over the line? So I think there was like 26 or so of them. And only about 5 of them, I estimated, are actually kind of palatable to the average voter, and they're all in the supply side, and they're all in either inner city urban renewal or greenfield expansion. And that's where I kind of end on this big down note, where I sort of say, well, given our inability to reconcile this is where all that pent up energy is going to go: greenfield expansion and inner city densification. And that's kind of where we're going. And I have this kind of like hypothetical scenario where I say, well, we're heading towards Southeast Queens blob, which is just going to be this huge blob between Noosa and Coolangatta and out to Toowoomba out to the west. It's a bit silly, but if that's where we're going though.
Yeah,
I think your comment actually is really poignant, because we spend so much time when we're having conversations about these issues more talking about, are you aware of how you've formed your view on what housing is? And a lot of the stuff that we're working on is primarily, most people are so ingrained into the current way of thinking about how they think about housing. It's culturally ingrained, as you said. It's also societally reinforced. And I know I see some of your notes are along those lines. And when I was reading your notes, I was like, wow, we spend so much time getting people back to that point, because it's not until the point where you can actually understand the core intrinsic failures of the current system that you can, and also understand, why am I making the same mistakes that everyone else has made? It's not until you get to that point that you can actually then say, well, what could an alternative solution look like? And that's sort of a bit of a question that I've got for you as well, is how is Australia's identity attached to how we think about our housing?
Well, first thing I'll say, Darren, is that you say people making the same mistakes as everyone else before them, but they're not mistakes. You know what I mean? The incentive structure is still there that if you buy a house and land and renovate it and spend all your money, like not only take on this huge mortgage with the expectation that someone further down the track will pay considerably more than you, but then you also take every spare cent that you make on top of that, renovating it to make it even more expensive without increasing the density. So, you know, still taking up the same amount of land, just so you have the entire country pouring every red cent they have into making their house more unaffordable. And that's like what our economy is kind of set up to do. It's kind of like, you know, you put the card deck under one leg of the pool table and all the balls just roll into one hole. Like that's kind of where everything is going. And I think it's just kind of a natural way things just go because of the ease and of which that people naturally do this. You know, people want their own house and that people want their own land. So people buy their own house and land because they want it, and it just so happens to be a great investment as well. So it's kind of a no-brainer.
Yeah.
And then when you zoom out though and you see everybody doing this at the same time, this is what I was saying earlier about all those kind of realities coming to the fore around, you know, just how cities expand and grow and renew. And we have a situation that we've kind of arrived at where most of our cities will never ever change because most of our cities are suburbs.
And they cannot, by definition, they cannot change. But I think there's also, you know, we've got all this, we've talked about all this cultural and societal and individual incentivization to go in the direction, to stay going in the direction we've gone. But if you stop and think about somebody like myself, who's very interested in better forms of doing everything, but housing has been one of those, you know, communities. How do we make better communities? And yet, when it came to me with bad health, having to move out of my contaminated favorite little space, did I have to struggle with that? And my health is much better. I'm much happier. But my heart said, but I want to be here in my own little private little space with all my trees around me. I don't care if it's moldy. I just want to be here. My heart said that. And I think there are a lot of people who are so attached to their houses and so attached to their magnificent loneliness in some ways. And that's another way deeper element than even these tax incentives and societal expectations and cultural norms. What do you think?
Yeah.
You know, I think that's totally natural and part of human nature. And again, this is, I think, not to get like too abstract and too deep, but like if you look at all of human history, how people lived, it's by staying in one spot pretty much,
Yeah.
with, you know, the odd weirdo who goes off into the wilderness and never comes back. But for most people throughout human history, we've stayed in the same spot, and that's kind of kept going all the way up until feudalism, where, you know, if you were a blacksmith, your children would be blacksmiths, and they would serve the children of your lord, and you would stay in the same place. And this is why we're able to do genetic mapping and you know, see that, oh yeah, you're from this region in Ireland, Riley Flanigan. And the modern, like, where the capitalism is kind of inherently destructive to communities because it means that land is associated with wealth, and so you're not actually around the people who would be naturally in your community. You're around people who are in your wealth bracket, and then when you go up or down in wealth, you go up or down in areas, and you sell your land and leave when you want to cash out. And it's just kind of inherently rubs against that inbuilt human nature to feel attached to your home. So I think, you know, again, this is why I have like a bunch of spicy opinions about how you can't really actually stop gentrification in a capitalist society, because you're talking about buying and selling land. You're talking about people bettering their circumstances. You're talking about investing in an area and uplifting its value, therefore making it more desirable, therefore increasing demand for housing, therefore, people buying and selling more land, and it just can't be. It can't be helped in a capitalist society. So if get mad at capitalism, don't get mad at gentrification.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on a couple of points there that we actually spend a fair bit of time trying to dive deeply into. This idea that the system we're stuck inside of is, it's medieval in its thinking, a lot of it. So, and I think you're feeding into, or you've also highlighted, a lot of people are feeding into that vision of how they want themselves to be seen. So, when you have a look at the words that are even tied up with how we have our property, I mean, you get issued a title, right? When you get your block of land, it's called a freehold title. So you get to be lord of your own entity. And then you get a mortgage, which means you're engaged to something till death. So all of these words are sitting right in front of us, and we don't understand how they're used until we actually dive into them. And then how do we then bring back the humanity side of things in amongst the system, which is obviously set up for individual benefit? And that's probably one of those things that we've been trying to figure out the most. Is you do understand that no matter what you do, if property continues to go up, there's groups of people who are just being excluded from the market. And the idea of people coming together is increasing, whether it's increasing density or co-housing or any of those models. And we have a model as well, which we work on. All of them require more people coming together. And I wonder whether, when people understand that Australia has, it might be the second highest rate of mental issues in anywhere in the world, with the exception of maybe the Ukraine, which I think takes number one, it would say that our housing is also isolating us and stopping us from developing as a community. And it's probably only when we have those realizations that our biases and the capitalist system, which have mechanisms for a reason, are actually genuinely impacting on our well-being as a nation, that we might actually say, and it's not everyone, but there might be groups of people who start to say, I need to do something different because I can't continue to create the same, results as what I've done by using the existing system.
Yeah, look, I don't disagree. And I'd never thought about those terms having that sort of etymology back in, the past. Of course, but of course they do. Yeah, and I think you're right about, people, if people can sort of kind of tie their living situation and the housing that increasingly is and will continue to be, if they can successfully tie that to their mental health, then maybe they will sort of, you might see a resurgence in the communes of like the late 60s, early 70s and that kind of thing, which they don't always seem to go so well, but we'll see. Like there are some successful examples. But I guess to say something nice about capitalism, after having slagged it a bit off there, is that it at least does allow for that to happen within it. So if you do want to start a kibbutz or whatever, you can do that. You just got to find a nice compound and start stockpiling weapons and all the rest.
I guess just very briefly, from our point of view, Riley, our experience of trying to be sustainable and innovative over the years has taught us enough to try and work within the parameters that exist, rather than asking for permission from politicians for a change. So we understand, and you're right talking about communal housing on a larger scale. I think the success rate is really quite poor over any extended period of time of larger communal settings. I think there's very few examples around the world where it works well for an extended period. But if we get down to smaller groups of people, and we're not going to replace the big four banks, we're not going to replace the established marketplace today or tomorrow, but we are proposing that there's an alternative way that allows all of us to retain a semblance of hope, and we get together with a like-minded group of people and do our own thing, navigating the existing system. It's an imperfect system. Will always continue to be an imperfect system. But if we have the tools to navigate through that without taking off the least amount of skin and skull knuckles and cost along the way, then there's some sort of hope. Because
absolutely,
continue to exclude people is not good.
Well, and if you guys or whoever lands on a successful model that is scalable, another great thing about capitalism is that a successful model is able to just experience that whoosh factor where it grows rapidly to fill the void. So if that solution is out there and it's landed on, there's no reason why it can't be an overnight success. That's why I'm quite optimistic about things like rent to own, where people, it requires a certain type of developer to invest in it, but where people ostensibly pay rent over time to own a place, I think is a much more sort of doable thing for most people.
Yeah, and we've been advancing some of those how do those mechanisms actually work by also saying, well, you're right that some of the numbers talk about 98% of larger scale communes fail over time. So we've found, obviously, with humans, you need smaller scale, right? So before you were alluding to our prehistory. When you have a look at where we were, probably we were in a small tribal group at some point in time. And we would struggle to then expand to, oh, look, we want to have 50 or 100 people. That doesn't work because we're all humans, right? We all get in the way of that. We're always looking from our own shadow at someone else's shadow. But ultimately, those smaller group capabilities, and we're thinking maybe some of those are down as small as 5, you then go, if 5 people were in a residence or a dwelling and those people were then renting to buy as a group, then you can break down the economics, right? The economics start to take care of itself. And some of these things might be stepping stones. They might be answers for aging in place. They might be answers for people just trying to get a foothold in the market. So we notice a lot of people potentially maybe in the, like yourself, maybe millennial or that around that area going, wow, man, all these baby boomers and older have got into the market. The prices are at a point we can't get in. Is there a stepping stone that can enable us to get a foothold there before jumping into the whole property? So there's still that upward motivation that humans have, but it gives you some slight step in there as a different level to be able to get in there. So I agree. I think there are other mechanisms out there, and that first step is really opening your brain to the idea of this is how the system currently works, and that's why I also have some, we don't like to use this word very often, but I have some hope that by you and people like yourself having conversations in this space, that people do start to go, hang on, this system is really broken, and me perpetuating the system that is broken, I can use its mechanisms to my benefit, but I need to understand that if I just, strap myself in there, that I'm probably mortgaging till death, engaging myself to death in something that might actually be affecting my wellness and my life experience moving forward. So with those sort of things you were talking about there, what's your feelings on vacant housing?
So I every time I've tried to look into that problem, I haven't really been able to find reliable information on how big it actually is. And again, this is so endemic of the problem where, where everybody's like, whenever I post an article on this, I get someone in the comments going, or like a heap of people in the comments going, if we just fill all the vacant housing and get rid of Airbnb, then the problem's solved. And I don't disagree with that approach of taxing vacant housing and getting rid of Airbnb in maybe big expensive cities where the housing is really bad or something like that. But what I don't know is how big the problem is and how much of an impact doing that would actually have. And that's why having a vacancy tax is one of my 26 housing policy proposals.
Saw that. Yeah.
And so, and another one, for example, is that I always get people pushing back on is immigration. And people really think, like a lot of people think, if you just either cut off or drastically reduced immigration, it would just solve the problem overnight. And I just, having like tried to hold all of these drivers in my mind at the same time and not knowing how big any one of them are, and this causes reasonable people to be able to disagree, and it also causes unreasonable people to be able to put the blinders on and shut out every other policy proposal that they don't like, and then not have to listen to it because everybody's kind of a bit right. So that's kind of how I feel about it. And any one thing is because I really wish I was actually an economist and I had the tools to be able to actually like find graphs and understand them,
I actually, interestingly enough, on this point, I was speaking to Colin Dwyer, who particularly for Northern Australia has got a lot of this data as an economist. And we were talking about some of this stuff because, as you said, some of the stuff that Rowan's actually dug up had sort of pointed to the fact that there might be 1 million vacant properties in Australia based upon some of the high-level stats that are out there, which is if there's 10 million established properties in Australia, that's 10% of our total housing stock is just missing in action. But I agree with you that there is a big delineation between what is vacant. If you've got your holiday house in, some little village somewhere in the middle of nowhere, freeing that up for rental properties is probably of little to no benefit to anyone. But certainly there's also another group which people identify quite easily, and we've picked it up a little bit as well. Like if you older women in particular, obviously blokes drop off the perch a bit earlier. There's a lot of single older women who are actually in properties. And one of the things that people don't realize is with the way the pension works, it might cost, even in a regional area, it might cost, $26,000 a year just to hold on to your property, right? So, and your pension is $28,000 a year. And you've got, a puppy dog and a cat that you're not eating, right? Like that's the reality of what a lot of people are existing from inside of our society. So we actually think rather than bashing people with vacant properties or near vacant properties, we should be incentivizing them to find ways to increase their density. And Colin Dwyer's thinking is along the same lines, because taking the stick is really what governments love to do. Let's put up interest rates. It'll stop. No, it doesn't work that way, right? And that's where I actually hope that we don't just go to let's bash everyone who's got an Airbnb or a second home, because it's, as you've alluded to, and I agree with you, that it's a lot more complex conversation than just coming up with, one single answer of, hey, let's get rid of them. So, yeah, I think that at least the conversation's out there.
Well, and another dimension to it is that they, just because a house is vacant, it doesn't mean it's the kind of house that a person who needs a house needs. And so, if you've got a one bedroom apartment that's vacant, and you beat the landlord over the stick saying you've got to fill that, but that's no use to a single mum with 3 kids or whatever. So I think it's an easy to understand dimension of the problem, and that's why people gravitate to it. And similar with immigration, it's just like, well, if we haven't got enough housing, why are we bringing so many people in? And then there's a lot of other reasons for immigration as well, beyond just not having a housing crisis. But yeah, God, sorry, I feel like I've gone off track there. I've forgotten the second half of
it. Absolutely. And I agree with you 100%. And I think also that was when I saw your comments in regards to Greenfield as not as a solution, but almost an inevitable direction to some extent. One of our big concerns that we've seen is, and your point there in regards to one bedroom sort of reminded me of it, is that we're starting to see a big misalignment in the types of property and the people who are going into them, right? So greenfield developments have historically only occurred because of the underpinning of financial ease of lending. So if you build, using construction terms, the old 4x2x2 in the burbs in greenfield, so 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, 2 garages in the burbs, the banks are like, high five, I've got all of these comparisons out there that are close to yours. So if yours in a bull rush, we'll give you 95% or some crazy thing. Now, that is showing a complete misalignment to the actual people that are going into the stock. So rental properties, there's 1, 2, and 3 bedders are being cried for because that's where affordability and also consistency with the demographics is actually sitting. So I would shudder to think what would happen if we continue to build completely misaligned product like would happen in a greenfield, because other countries around the world, like even Germany, have got to a point where they go, there's no one to move into this 4 or 5 bedroom house. We'll just shut down the whole suburb. And if we don't think about that, that could actually be the flow-on effect of letting a greenfield developer continue to lend because the banks will underpin it.
Yeah, well, honestly, I didn't even know that was a calculation that was happening on the bank's end, but it makes total sense. I do know that, as being someone my age, I have a lot of friends that are my age, and we're all, everybody is kind of being forced into making the decision about, well, do I buy a place in the outer suburbs, spend half my life commuting, or do I just buy a unit that's like actually like, somewhere where I could live? And if you look at that, for the Brisbane context, the boom in apartments that happened around like 2015 through to like maybe 2019 or 2018, I don't know. It was very much all investor stock, and it was very much all 1 bedroom apartments, and that's all like South Brisbane and Newstead and that kind of area.
Yeah.
And those are not suited for people who are owner occupiers, basically. And you actually are already seeing, because we at Urbis, we get we have economists in the building and with us in our team, and they have access to all this data around what's getting built and what's where the demand is for. And 3-bedroom apartments have actually gone up significantly from that period, because I think just the natural economic pressures and realities of me and everybody younger than me basically is forcing people to make those kinds of decisions and then ask the developers for those stock.
Right.
And how is that conversation going? Like, how are these conversations coming up when you're out, at a party or going to a barbecue or whatever? Is there a bit of a feel towards desperation in amongst your friend group to what the solutions are, or?
Oh yeah, well, it's it's just kind of I don't think you sort of, when you're in any situation, I think you don't really realize how crazy it is until it's over. Like, I have a bunch of friends who bought during that really sort of like real FOMO sort of fever pitch during COVID. And now that things have like cooled a little bit with interest rates going up, they're going, oh, why did I do that? But I as long as they hold on to it, it'll still go up, because there is more demand than there is supply, I guess, or at least it seems that way. There are people that disagree with that. But yeah, I mean, I don't really know what to say. Some people are dirty about it. Some people just don't even think about it.
It is interesting that when I had a look at some of the stats in regards to when they started talking about homelessness, and now we've got $10 billion to throw at something and see how that goes. I found it interesting that something you've said in a bit of your notes as well is this idea is, and you just mentioned there again, I find it interesting that people, when they go into home ownership, are willing to absorb so much more pain than when you go into renting. So like when you have a look at the relationship of the amount of your wage that goes when you're owning it versus what happens when people say they're under rental pressure, the two numbers aren't even comparable, right? You know, you're way deeper when you're trying to own it, trying to hang on to it for no particular reason at all. And that's why I sometimes march out those terms, those medieval terms. And I think a lot of it is we build inside this, you know, we're getting a title, so we must be the lord or the lady of the manor. So we can physically, you know, we can be more, you know, mortgaged to our deaths because we get to own this thing. And I think that's one of those. And I noticed you wrote some stuff there about biases. That's really hard for us to get around with. Do you find that people are more or less comfortable with renting? Like, what's the concern with saying, hey, what if I did start something smaller and rented rather than feel the need to shackle myself to such a large amount?
Well, this is where I guess, you know, because in Australia, we've really had a lot of sort of luxurious complacency when it comes to growing our wealth, because we buy a property because we want one, and that just happens to be the right decision. And if that is taken out, and then it's like, okay, if I'm not, you know, making my long-term financial plans based on property ownership, what am I basing it on? And then most people, you know, I don't know about you guys, but when I was in school, they didn't teach me anything about investing. They didn't teach me anything about, you know, an exchange traded fund, an index fund, a listed investment company, none of those things. But they're actually fairly easy to understand. You just need to like get over the hump. So I feel like there's a real sort of educational issue that is in the way of people being a lot more comfortable with renting. But then I also think, you know, Australia could do a lot better in terms of its rental rights and protections as well, where if you know you look in Europe, they have, you know, much longer term leases, and they have you know, no fault sort of evictions, and that, you know, you have the ability to make cosmetic changes, you can get a dog, all those kinds of things, where it's like for some people, you know, those are literally the reasons they buy a house, is because they want to be able to put up some artwork and get a dog, you know. And so if we just sort of like, if there is, to whatever extent there is a group of people who would be comfortable with renting, but for those, the educational and the rental rights issues, it's like, why aren't we doing those? So this gets into that whole, you know, miasma of into this issue, and that represents a pocket of it. We don't know how big, but this is why to me it is like the Blob, you know, like the old movie where it's like you cut off a piece of it, it doesn't actually hurt it, it just keeps going. So you've got to kind of kill the whole blob, you know.
Which is an absolutely monumental task.
And so how do we do that, Riley?
Well, honestly, I don't think we can. So this is the thing, it's like even if we did do that, that in itself, I think, wouldn't be without its consequences. You know what I mean? And it might, because you're really talking about fundamentally transforming the economy.
Yes.
And so it's like that's no joke. You know what I mean? Like that's a different paradigm going forward. I do think it would be better, because one of the points I make is that one of the issues with housing is that it sucks up every dollar in the economy, essentially, where everybody's entire net worth is poured into that one stagnant asset, and that houses don't really do anything beyond artificial scarcity and just relying on society's perception of their wealth to accumulate over time. And so what I sort of say is like there's a huge opportunity cost sort of hidden beneath that around, you know, what would society look like if we actually freed up all that money to be invested in productive things that actually create innovation and wealth. Because another huge drawback of our housing crisis that nobody talks about, which is that we have one of the least economically complex economies in the world. We're behind Uganda and Senegal in economic complexity, which means that we're really vulnerable.
One trick pony.
Yeah, we've got mining, we've got like higher education, and everything else is just kind of us like making websites for each other, and like, you know what I mean? And this is why they bring in so much immigration, is because they're wanting to just keep the demand high for all these services that don't actually like bring in raw wealth like a place like Vietnam does, for example, which actually sells stuff to the world. So if we actually weren't pouring all this money into one set of stagnant asset classes, what could our country be? You know, that's like an open question.
I think,
it's a really
you go,
it's
Christine.
a really good place. You summarise, Riley, and getting us to, we're probably close to time, but we do talk to some of the fear factor that we have in our community. And I think it's more than 50% of our households in Australia have a fear about housing security and tenure. So whether it's their lease expiring within the next 12 months and how I afford $100 a week rent rise, or just the impending going from fixed to variable rate interest, and what does that mean for my household budget? So there's that huge portion of our population who have fear. And then the imagining, if we built housing that enabled us to thrive at our best self, what could that look like? And that speaks volumes to that opportunity cost. That at the moment we're just getting into the market and buying this thing, and then tipping everything, as you point out, everything we own into that to build a bigger, more unaffordable thing. It's a fascinating topic, and a large part of People Purpose Place is to have these longer form conversations. We need to be able to unpick ideas, expose them to daylight, and hopefully you'll be able to come back at some future point in time to continue this conversation, because I think we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, I know it's one of those things where there'll be no shortages of rocks to overturn and all sorts of ugliness to expose.
and giving it some sunlight and airing these conversations is the important first step. For those listening at home or joining into this podcast at a later point in time, there is an alternative to the mainstream process. But as you point out, we can't switch the whole mainstream housing market overnight on its head. Let's start with baby steps. Let's do one at a time. Let's do one in your neighbourhood. Let's touch and feel one, and then feel whether that's an appropriate and comfortable path for all of us to consider. Christine,
thanks for having me, guys. Had a great time.
Thank you. Really appreciate your time, Riley. Christine, Darren, any points to summarise?
No, absolutely. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I think I also like your analogy where you say use the not in my backyard, and I think something that I think we need to continue to do is to say, well, what if we were to do this? What would be the flow-on effects of that? Because as you said, the complexity around housing is really, really quite deep, and I think we now are in the generation where the changes will occur. As much as we've seen the pressure and said, it's diabolical 20 years ago, I think your generation, unfortunately, is going to be the one who's really going to have to, as you've even said in your notes, navigate the real change, because I don't think the system can roll on as it is without actually having major fractures. So I think having these tic-tac conversations that, everyone's trying to get the soundbite to make a headline, but really diving down into why this thing could work and why it couldn't work is really, really valuable for other people to be able to also engage in this conversation. So I appreciate you taking those steps, and hopefully we can continue the conversation.
Well, and if I could end on one soundbite, I think one of the things I advocate for most is legalizing the missing middle, which is basically allowing missing middle typologies like townhouses in existing suburbs, and I know that
Mm.
this is one of the ones that I say is completely politically unpalatable, but it is one of the ones that I think is palatable to the Australian psyche of land ownership, because at least with a townhouse, you're still a landowner. And so you can still
Mm.
continue the paradigm of sitting on something as it accumulates in value without having to learn about investing. And I kind of think that's easier to overcome. But and we have seen places that have done this in, OECD countries, but yeah, I guess we'll have to check back in a decade to see whether it's been successful. But yeah, and then also read my blog if you've found me interesting, rileyflanigan.substack.com.
Perfect.
Thank you, sir. Have a cracking day. Thanks, Christine. Thanks, Darren.
Speak again soon. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Scott. We can check out.